Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her group of friends. While others shared dramatic stories about their relationships or complained about their families, she would simply nod and listen. Her co-workers at the small accounting firm where she worked saw her as someone who lived a peaceful, ordinary life. She never missed work, always had her lunch packed neatly, and wore long-sleeved blouses even during the hottest summer days. When conversations turned to difficult topics like domestic violence or abuse, Sarah would shift uncomfortably in her chair and change the subject. Her friends began to notice this pattern. During their weekly coffee meetings, whenever someone mentioned seeing a news story about a woman being hurt by her partner, Sarah would suddenly remember she had an important phone call to make or would excuse herself to use the restroom. "She's so lucky," her friend Jessica would often say. "Her life seems so perfect and drama-free. I wish I had her problems." The others would agree, envying what they saw as Sarah's calm existence. They imagined her going home each evening to a loving husband who helped with dinner and asked about her day. Marcus, Sarah's husband of 8 years, was well-liked in their community. He volunteered at the local church, helped elderly neighbors with their yard work, and always had a smile and kind word for everyone he met. When people saw them together at social gatherings, Marcus would have his arm around Sarah's shoulders, speaking warmly about how proud he was of his wife's accomplishments at work. The couple lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, with a well-maintained garden that Sarah tended to every weekend. Neighbors would wave as she worked among the flowers, and she would wave back with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Behind the white picket fence and cheerful yellow shutters, a different reality existed that no one could see. Sarah had become an expert at hiding. She knew exactly which makeup techniques would cover the faint bruises that appeared around her arms and shoulders. She had learned to time her grocery shopping for when the marks were less visible, and she had mastered the art of deflecting personal questions with gentle humor and quick topic changes. Her wardrobe had gradually shifted over the years from the colorful, short-sleeved tops she once loved to a collection of cardigans, blazers, and long-sleeved shirts in neutral colors. She told herself it was just a change in personal style, a sign of growing more professional and mature. Deep down, she knew the real reason for every clothing choice she made. The isolation had happened so gradually that Sarah barely noticed it herself. First, Marcus had suggested they didn't need to visit her family so often, because the drive was long and expensive. Then he mentioned that her friends seemed to take up too much of her time and energy. Slowly, her world had shrunk to just work, home, and the careful performance of being the perfect couple that everyone admired. At night, lying in bed next to Marcus as he slept peacefully, Sarah would stare at the ceiling and wonder how her life had become so different from what she had imagined. She remembered the woman she used to be, someone who laughed easily and spoke her mind without fear. That version of herself felt like a character from a book she had read long ago, someone real but unreachable. When her alarm clock rang each morning at 6:30, Sarah would carefully get dressed, apply her makeup with practiced precision, and prepare for another day of maintaining the illusion that everything in her world was exactly as it should be. She had become so skilled at this performance that sometimes she almost believed it herself. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in September. Sarah had stopped at the grocery store after work to pick up ingredients for the dinner Marcus had requested that morning. She found herself standing in the produce section, holding a bag of carrots, when she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had chosen what to cook for dinner in her own home. As she reached for a bunch of celery, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a dark purple bruise that wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet. An elderly woman shopping nearby noticed and gave Sarah a look of concern. Sarah quickly pulled her sleeve down and hurried away, her heart racing with embarrassment and fear. That same week, her friend Lisa invited her to join a new book club that met Thursday evenings at the community center. Sarah's immediate instinct was to decline, as she always did with social invitations, but something made her pause. The book they were reading was about a woman who had traveled alone across the country to start a new life. The idea of such freedom and independence stirred something deep inside Sarah that she had almost forgotten existed. When she mentioned the book club to Marcus at dinner, his reaction was swift and predictable. His voice remained calm and controlled, but his eyes took on that cold, dangerous look she knew so well. He explained, with the patience of someone talking to a child, why the book club was a bad idea. He reminded her of all the responsibilities she had at home and how tired she always was after work. The conversation ended the way these discussions always did, with Sarah apologizing for being selfish and agreeing that Marcus was right. But for the first time in years, a small part of her mind held on to the image of that woman traveling freely, making her own choices about where to go and what to do next. At work the following day, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to conversations she would normally tune out. When her coworker Jennifer mentioned having to leave early for her daughter's soccer game, Sarah felt a pang of longing for such simple, normal problems. When another colleague complained about her husband forgetting to take out the trash, Sarah almost laughed at how trivial and wonderful such complaints seemed. During her lunch break, Sarah walked to the small park across from her office building and sat on a bench she had never noticed before. She watched other people moving freely through their lives, talking on phones, walking dogs, pushing children on swings. Everyone seemed to inhabit their own existence so naturally, making decisions both small and large without asking permission or calculating consequences. A mother was teaching her young daughter to ride a bicycle, running alongside the wobbling bike and offering encouragement. Sarah remembered learning to ride her own bike in the driveway of her childhood home, her father holding the seat steady until she was ready to go on her own. She tried to remember the last time she had felt that kind of support. Someone helping her move forward rather than holding her back. That evening, as she prepared dinner in the familiar routine she had perfected over the years, Sarah caught her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. Her hands moved automatically, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, while her mind wandered to places far from the quiet kitchen where she spent so many hours. The bruise on her wrist had faded to a yellowish green, but she could still feel the phantom pressure of fingers that had gripped too tightly. She found herself wondering what would happen if she simply didn't cover it next time, if she let people see what her long sleeves had been hiding for so many years. The incident that changed everything happened on a Friday night in October. Sarah had been looking forward to a quiet weekend, planning to work in her garden and catch up on reading. Marcus had been drinking more than usual that evening, something that always made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. The argument started over something insignificant, a comment Sarah made about wanting to plant some new flowers in the spring. Marcus interpreted this as criticism of the current garden, then expanded it into a criticism of him, and finally into evidence that Sarah was ungrateful for everything he provided for her. What followed was worse than usual. Marcus grabbed Sarah by the shoulders and shook her hard enough that her teeth rattled. When she stumbled backward trying to get away, he caught her by the arm and twisted it behind her back until she cried out in pain. The force he used was different this time, more violent and less controlled than the calculated intimidation she had grown accustomed to. When it was over, Sarah lay on the bedroom floor, her back against the dresser where she had fallen. Marcus stood over her for a moment, his breathing heavy, before walking out of the room as if nothing had happened. Sarah heard the television turn on downstairs and the familiar sound of a football game commentary. She stayed on the floor for a long time, too shocked and hurt to move. When she finally pulled herself up and looked in the mirror, she saw something that made her gasp. The corner of the dresser had caught her back as she fell, leaving 3 deep scratches that ran from her shoulder blade down toward her spine. Blood had soaked through her shirt in dark, spreading stains. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something stronger than fear. She felt angry, not just at Marcus, but at herself for accepting this life for so long. As she cleaned the wounds as best she could and applied bandages, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and firmness. The next Monday, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. Instead of staying home, she drove to the public library and sat at a computer terminal, researching things she had never allowed herself to think about before. She looked up women's shelters, legal aid services, and support groups. She learned about restraining orders and safe houses and the process of filing for divorce. The information was overwhelming and frightening, but also strangely empowering. For the first time, Sarah began to see her situation not as an unchangeable fate, but as a problem that could be solved. She printed out several pages of information and hid them in her car, in a folder she kept with her insurance papers. That evening, Marcus was unusually attentive, bringing her tea and asking if she felt better. This pattern was familiar to Sarah, the cycle of violence followed by apparent remorse and kindness. But this time, instead of feeling grateful for his attention, she felt disgusted by the manipulation. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began making small changes that no one else would notice. She started keeping a spare key to her car hidden in her desk at work. She opened a small savings account at a different bank, depositing $20 or $30 whenever she could manage it without Marcus noticing. She memorized the phone numbers for the domestic violence hotline and the nearest women's shelter. Most importantly, she started documenting everything. She took photos of bruises and injuries with the camera on her phone, saving them to a cloud storage account Marcus didn't know about. She wrote down dates and details of incidents in a small notebook she kept hidden at work. She was building a case, not just for a potential legal proceeding but for herself, proof that what was happening to her was real and serious. The scratches on her back healed slowly, leaving thin white scars that she could feel when she moved in certain ways. Instead of hiding from these marks, Sarah found herself touching them sometimes, reminding herself of the moment when she had decided to stop accepting the unacceptable. The opportunity Sarah had been unconsciously waiting for came in November. Her company announced that they would be hosting a health fair for employees, complete with basic medical screenings and consultations with healthcare professionals. Sarah had been avoiding doctors for years, afraid that someone might ask uncomfortable questions about injuries that couldn't be easily explained away. But the nurse practitioner assigned to her screening was a middle-aged woman named Carol who had kind eyes and a gentle manner. During the routine examination, Carol asked Sarah to remove her blouse so she could check her blood pressure and listen to her heart. Sarah hesitated, then made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, Sarah let someone see her back. The scars from the dresser incident were clearly visible, along with older marks that told a story of repeated trauma. Carol's expression remained professional, but Sarah could see the recognition in her eyes. This woman had seen these kinds of injuries before. Carol didn't immediately ask questions or make accusations. Instead, she completed the examination quietly and efficiently. But as Sarah was putting her blouse back on, Carol handed her a small card with a phone number written on it. "Sometimes people need to talk to someone," Carol said simply. "This is a friend of mine who works with women who are going through difficult situations. Her name is Elena, and she's available anytime, day or night." Sarah took the card with trembling hands and slipped it into her purse. That evening, she sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the card and gathering the courage to make a phone call that would change her life forever. When Elena answered, her voice was warm and understanding. She didn't ask for details or demand explanations. Instead, she listened as Sarah stumbled through her story, speaking aloud for the first time about the reality of her marriage. Elena asked practical questions about Sarah's safety and resources, and together they began to develop a plan. The plan was more complex than Sarah had imagined. Elena explained that leaving an abusive relationship was often the most dangerous time for a woman, and that careful preparation could make the difference between success and tragedy. They discussed safe places Sarah could go, times when Marcus would be away from the house, and ways to minimize the risk of him finding her. Elena also connected Sarah with a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana, explained Sarah's legal options and helped her understand the process of filing for divorce and obtaining a restraining order. Diana was impressed by the documentation Sarah had already gathered and assured her that she had strong grounds for legal protection. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself living a double life more consciously than ever before. On the surface, she maintained the routine that Marcus expected. She cooked his meals, cleaned the house, and played the role of the dutiful wife. But underneath, she was methodically preparing for her escape. She identified the items she would take with her, focusing on important documents, a few precious belongings, and practical necessities. She learned the schedules of the women's shelter and practiced the route she would take to get there. She even opened her own post office box so she could receive mail without Marcus knowing about it. The hardest part was managing her emotions. As her plans became more concrete, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror that sometimes left her lightheaded. She was afraid of Marcus discovering her preparations, but she was equally afraid of her own courage failing her when the time came to act. One evening, as she was washing dishes and Marcus was watching television, Sarah caught herself humming a song she hadn't thought of in years. It was a song her mother used to sing while cooking dinner, something about freedom and open roads. Marcus looked up from his show with a suspicious expression and asked why she seemed so cheerful. Sarah quickly apologized and explained that she must have heard the song on the radio at work, but inside, she recognized the humming as a sign that some part of her spirit was already preparing to fly. The moment of truth arrived on a cold January morning when Marcus announced he would be attending a weekend workshop for work, something that would keep him away from home for 3 full days. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and she felt her heart begin to race as soon as he told her about his plans. She spent the week before his departure in careful preparation, moving small items to her car each day and rehearsing every step of her plan. Elena had arranged for Sarah to stay at a safe house run by a woman named Margaret, who had herself escaped an abusive marriage 20 years earlier. The location was kept secret from everyone except the residents and staff, ensuring that angry partners couldn't track down women who had fled. On Friday morning, Sarah kissed Marcus goodbye at the front door, just as she had done countless times before. But this time she knew it would be the last time. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, she sprang into action with an efficiency that surprised her. She gathered the documents she had prepared: copies of their marriage certificate, her birth certificate, bank statements, and the extensive photographic evidence of her injuries. She packed 2 suitcases with clothes and personal items, focusing on practical necessities rather than sentimental objects. The hardest thing to leave behind was a photo of her parents, but she knew she could ask her sister to retrieve it later. Before leaving the house, Sarah walked through each room one final time. The kitchen, where she had spent so many hours preparing meals she rarely enjoyed. The living room, where she had sat in careful silence while Marcus watched television. The bedroom, where she had lain awake so many nights planning for this exact moment. In the bedroom, she wrote a letter to Marcus, explaining that she was leaving and that he should not try to contact her. The letter was brief and factual, without anger or blame, just a clear statement that their marriage was over. She left it on his pillow, where he would find it when he returned on Sunday night. The drive to the safe house felt like the longest and shortest journey of Sarah's life. Every mile took her further from the life she had known, but also closer to the woman she remembered being before fear had shaped her into someone she barely recognized. Elena met her at a neutral location and led her to the safe house, where Margaret greeted her with an understanding smile and a warm cup of coffee. The safe house was a large, comfortable home that housed 6 women and their children at various stages of rebuilding their lives. Sarah was struck by the atmosphere of support and solidarity among the residents. These women, who had all faced similar situations, created a community of strength and encouragement that Sarah had never experienced before. On her first night in the safe house, Sarah lay in a narrow bed in a room she shared with another woman, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete, physical safety. No one was going to hurt her while she slept. No one was monitoring her movements or questioning her choices. For the first time in almost a decade, Sarah fell asleep without fear. The next morning, Diana the lawyer called to tell Sarah that she had successfully filed for divorce and obtained a temporary restraining order. Marcus would be served with papers as soon as he returned from his trip, and he would be legally prohibited from contacting Sarah or coming near her workplace. When Marcus returned home on Sunday evening and found Sarah's letter, his reaction was exactly what Elena and Diana had predicted. He called Sarah's phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly angry messages. He drove to her workplace and demanded to speak with her, only to be turned away by security guards who had been briefed on the situation. He even contacted Sarah's family, claiming that his wife had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and disappeared. But Sarah was safe, surrounded by people who understood exactly what she was going through, and who supported her decision to reclaim her life. For the first time in years, Sarah began to make plans for her future based on what she wanted, not what someone else demanded of her. 6 months after leaving Marcus, Sarah stood in the doorway of her new apartment, a small but bright space on the 3rd floor of a building across town. The apartment had large windows that faced east, filling the rooms with morning sunlight that she had learned to appreciate as a symbol of new beginnings. The divorce proceedings had been difficult, but successful. Diana had presented Sarah's evidence so effectively that Marcus's lawyer had advised him to accept the settlement rather than risk a trial that would expose his behavior publicly. The restraining order had been made permanent, and Marcus was required to attend anger management counseling as part of the agreement. Sarah's transformation was visible to everyone who knew her. Her coworkers noticed that she smiled more genuinely and spoke up in meetings with ideas and opinions she had kept to herself for years. Her friends were amazed by the change in her confidence and energy. Jessica, who had once envied Sarah's seemingly perfect life, now marveled at her courage and strength. The most significant change was in how Sarah dressed. For the first time since her marriage, she wore short sleeves and sleeveless tops without shame or fear. The scars on her back and arms were visible reminders of what she had survived, but she no longer saw them as marks of victimization. Instead, they had become proof of her resilience and evidence of how far she had traveled from the frightened woman she used to be. Sarah had returned to counseling, working with a therapist who specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence rebuild their sense of self. Through these sessions, she learned to recognize the patterns of control and manipulation that had slowly isolated her from her own instincts and desires. She practiced making decisions, both large and small, based on her own preferences rather than fear of someone else's reaction. The book club that had once seemed impossible to join became a regular part of Sarah's weekly routine. The group had become close friends who supported each other through various life challenges. When Sarah finally shared her story with them, they were shocked to learn what had been hidden behind her quiet demeanor, but they rallied around her with love and encouragement. Margaret from the safe house had become a mentor and friend. She encouraged Sarah to consider sharing her story with other women who might be trapped in similar situations. Sarah began volunteering at the shelter, offering support to newly arrived residents and helping them navigate the practical challenges of starting over. On a warm Saturday morning in July, Sarah was working in the small garden she had created on her apartment building's roof when her phone rang. It was Elena, calling with news about a woman who had contacted the domestic violence hotline. The woman's situation was remarkably similar to what Sarah's had been, and she was afraid to take the steps necessary to protect herself. Sarah found herself agreeing to meet with this woman, a teacher named Maria, who had been married for 12 years to a man who had gradually isolated her from friends and family. When they met for coffee, Sarah recognized the careful way Maria sat, the long sleeves despite the summer heat, and the quick glances toward the door as if planning an escape route. As Sarah shared her own story, she watched Maria's expression change from hopelessness to something that looked like possibility. Sarah showed Maria the faded scars on her arms and back, explaining how these marks had once been sources of shame, but had become symbols of survival and strength. By the end of their conversation, Maria had Elena's phone number and a plan for her own safety. As Sarah watched her walk away, she realized that her experience, as painful as it had been, now served a purpose beyond her own healing. She was able to offer hope to other women who were still trapped in the darkness she had escaped. That evening, Sarah sat on her apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, someone who believed she was powerless to change her circumstances. She thought about all the women still trapped in situations like the one she had escaped, and about the strength they would find within themselves when they were ready to claim it. The scars on her back caught the last rays of sunlight, and Sarah smiled as she remembered the night they were made. That moment of violence had become the catalyst for her freedom, the breaking point that finally gave her the courage to save herself. Her story had transformed from one of victimization to one of triumph, and now she was using that story to help others write their own endings.